Hey everybody, it's Steve Presser. Welcome back. We're in week number 3 here on our study of perspectives of the Passion. And this week we're looking at another interesting character that surrounds the Passion story. It's the man Simon of Cyrene, and famously he was the one who helped to carry the cross of Christ. And so what we want to look at today is we're titling this From Coercion to Conversion. And we're going to look at some perspectives of Simon, because not only is he mentioned in the scriptures, but also his sons. So before we get too deep into this, I just want to ask you, maybe you can relate to the story that I have. And that is, when I was a young kid, my parents would bring us to church. Some people might say drag us to church kicking and screaming. But my parents did that. They brought us to church, and it probably wasn't until my late teenage years that I remember hearing someone ask the question, is this your faith or is this your parents' faith? And I remember wrestling with that to a great extent, because for so many years I had been, in a way, coerced into attending church, going through confirmation at a Lutheran church and school. I had to do it because my parents told me to do it. Didn't really have much of a choice. But when that question came of, is this your faith or is this your parents' faith? That's when I began to wrestle with the truths that were in front of me all this time. And it was there in my late teenage years where I felt for myself I had truly been able to willingly surrender and give my life over to Jesus. And now we do that each and every day, of course, but at least at that point in time, that's where I said, Lord, I believe on you, and I trust in you. And I think we're going to see some of that in Simon's story as we get to know him a little bit more as well. So let's get reacquainted with this a little bit. If you have a Bible, let's turn to Luke chapter 23, looking at verses 26 to 43. And so it reads here, and as they led him away, they seized one, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country. So he's coming in, he's a pilgrim to the area, who was coming in from the country, laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. So keep that in mind. And there followed him a great multitude of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs who never bore and the breasts who never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? And 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They cast lots to divide his garments, and the people stood by watching. But the ruler scoffed at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, saying, If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him we talked about last time, This is the King of the Jews. And one of the criminals who was hanged there railed at him, saying, Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence and condemnation? And we indeed justly for our receiving the due reward for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. You know, it's an interesting thought to think that Simon was forced to carry the cross of Christ. But one thing that we maybe haven't thought of much of is, how long did he linger at the crucifixion site? It's very possible that all that we read, Simon was a witness to as well. And we're going to see as we go into this that it very likely completely changed his life. So from a human point of view, Simon was compelled to carry the cross. But yet from a divine point of view, I think what we're going to see is that Simon was actually liberated. by doing so. He was a helper to Jesus, but in effect, he actually was helped himself, as we will see later. He carries the instrument of death for Jesus, but in believing on Jesus, he actually carried the instrument that would give him life. He bears the instrument of Christ's condemnation, and yet he also bears the instrument of his own forgiveness. And some might say from a human point of view that this event was completely by chance and happenstance. But this event seems to be an event of divine providence and of grace. So who is the man, Simon of Cyrene? Well, there's another passage I want us to just briefly look at in Mark 15. So the story of Simon of Cyrene, he's actually mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John doesn't record him, but the other three Gospels do. If you look at Mark chapter 15, looking at verse 16, it reads this way: "And the soldiers led him inside the palace," that is the governor's headquarters. This is beforehand. "They clothed him in a purple cloak, twisting together a crown of thorns, put on him. They put the crown on him. They began to salute him, 'Hail, King of the Jews.' And they were striking his head with the reed and spitting on him, kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, stripped him of the purple cloak, they put his clothes on him, they led him out to crucify him." It goes on to say, "And they compelled," again, "a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh. He did not take it." And the scripture would continue to tell much of the same story that we read a moment ago. It's an interesting thing about Simon of Cyrene. Very few people are mentioned by name when it comes to the entire crucifixion of Jesus. The women that we read of in one of the passages, it just simply states that the women came mourning. There's no one mentioned by name. It talks about two criminals on the cross. None of them were named by name. We see various rulers mentioned. We hear that there are soldiers, but no one by name, who mocked Jesus. We would see later that there was a centurion who said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." He's not mentioned by name either. And we also see that there are great crowds. So apart from Simon of Cyrene, and after Jesus' death, you have Joseph of Arimathea, really only Mary and John who were physically at the site of Jesus' crucifixion. There's really no one else named by name. And it would make sense for someone to be named if they volunteered the cross, to carry the cross, I should say, because then you want to know, well, who is this person who identified himself? Who is this that volunteered themselves? But Simon was a pilgrim just showing up in time for the Passover. He's from Cyrene. He's an out-of-towner. And so he's just simply at the right place at the right time, or maybe the wrong place at the wrong time. I think it's the right place for him, given what we're going to see. But it's just an interesting thought to kind of dwell on and to think about. He was compelled. And Simon of Cyrene, where is Cyrene? Well, Cyrene is located in northern Africa, northern Libya to be exact. It was the capital city at the time of a Roman district called Cyrenaica, I believe is how it's pronounced, or Cyrenaica. You'll have to look at that one. But at any rate, there was a large Jewish population there at the time. And so in all likelihood, Simon was a pilgrim coming to Jerusalem because if you recall from one of our other studies, all male Jews had to attend 3 key festivals each year, Passover being one of them. So if he's a faithful Jew, he would have been making the trip. And so here he is, right place, right time, showing up for Passover as a Jew. And so we could spend a lot of time thinking and talking about the providence of God in this regard, and the fact that he just so happened to be picked out by the Romans to carry this cross. But if you think about it from Simon's point of view, he's just a man, right? And I'm sure at the moment, he was just a man. And you and I, we are just ordinary people trying to live life. And yet there are times in life when God will interrupt and show up big time and give you a life-altering moment. And this seems to be what happens. Sometimes God will use very unusual and unpredictable situations and circumstances to grab your attention. And for Simon, this is going to be a life-changing experience for sure. So you have the man Simon, and then you have this mandate that's placed on him that we read about in Mark 15:21. It says that they compelled a passerby. And he didn't choose this. It was chosen for him by the Romans. Speaking earthly, he was chosen by the Romans, but more on a divine count, I think God chose him. And we'll see a little bit more clear why in a moment. But according to history, those executed would have had to bear their own cross. And Jesus made use of this when he taught about the cost of discipleship. If you remember in Luke 14:27, he says that whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. There is a willingness to lay down one's own life. That is the extent that Jesus is saying, it's the degree to which you must go if you're going to actually follow Jesus. And as we read earlier, it's interesting that Simon was behind Jesus when he was carrying the crossbeam. And so from the perspective of Simon, Luke's gospel says that he was behind him. And what a sight. What a sight to be looking at Jesus, to be following after Jesus, to take up Jesus' cross and follow after Jesus. Because think about it. What happened to Simon? And what did he see? What did he see? He was compelled to help. He didn't volunteer. They seized him out of the crowd. He followed Jesus out of fear for his own life because the Romans were on top of him. And Jesus taught of this compulsion as well. If you think back, Matthew 5:41, he says, if anyone compels you to go 1 mile, go with him too. And so Jesus is teaching a little bit about, some grace issues but the Romans had that authority over them that they could compel someone to go and carry equipment or whatever for upwards to 1 mile. And Jesus is saying, well, show them grace and go too, But no writer articulates why Simon was forced to do this. It just seems to be a cultural norm of the day, given the fact that they were under Roman rule. And so we can only speculate as to why Simon was picked out. Maybe it was because he was just nearby. Maybe he was the most fit. Maybe he was, fairly young and healthy, and so they just said, you. We don't know. But some of the questions is, well, what else did Simon see with his own eyes? We're talking about perspectives of the passion. What else did he see with his own eyes? Well, he saw an exhausted Jesus, an absolutely exhausted Jesus who had a sleepless night. Remember, he was taken captive in the garden, had a sleepless night, being bounced back and forth between different councils and rulers to hear him out until he was eventually told that he would be executed in the morning hours. Simon also saw a scourged, walking dead man in front of him. We read the account where they scourged Jesus as a punishment, hoping that would satisfy the crowd. That would be Pilate. But it didn't satisfy the crowd. And so Pilate had to send him away to his own execution. So he's walking behind and he's seeing the bruised and beaten and battered and shredded, bloodied Jesus. He's seeing this exhausted, slowly moving man who the Romans may have been growing impatient of because of his pace, and that's likely why they had Simon carry the crossbeam, is Jesus physically just was no longer able to do so. And so they compel a fit man to do what an unfit man can do. Interesting thought, that Jesus was the fit man to do for us what we are unfit to do, to live a perfect and sinless life. So from a human point of view, that looks like nothing short of chance, but from a divine point of view, it's really grace for Simon. And we know that Simon's an out-of-towner who probably never met, maybe not even had heard of who this Jesus was. And it's not about what he carried, it's about what he sees. He witnessed and he heard everything along the way, and I can only think that Simon would have more than likely stayed, at least for a while, to see all the accounts of the crucifixion. As I said, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all record the account of Simon of Cyrene. And perhaps he is named because he represents such a significant element in our own faith. So in Mark 15:21, there's a subtle hint that we read. It said that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Do you know who Alexander and Rufus are? I don't. At least not much, not after doing this study anyhow. So why include the sons if you're the gospel writer, unless you and your audience know who they are? So Mark seems to believe that his readers know who Alexander and Rufus are. Mark's gospel was written largely based on Peter's eyewitness account and testimony of Jesus. And the gospel account was said to have been written in Rome to Roman believers. And this is important because at the end of the book of Romans, Paul writes in Romans 16:13, and he speaks specifically in his final greetings that he wishes upon the people. He specifically mentions Rufus and his mother. Later in the book of Acts, in chapter 2, verse 10, we see that there are Cyrenians present at Pentecost. So again, Jews would have had to travel to that festival. You might start picking up some of the pieces here that if Simon of Cyrene had two sons, and if this incident with Jesus was so impactful on his life, he would have shared that with his sons. Matter of fact, his sons may very well have been there with him. And this encounter with Jesus would then bring them back to Cyrene, and perhaps they would share this story. And we see at Pentecost that there were Cyrenians present at Pentecost. In Acts 11:19-20, we see that there are Cyrenians who served as missionaries. It said that the Cyrenians came to Antioch and spoke to the Hellenists, preaching Jesus. And in Acts 13, verse 1, there are Cyrenian witnesses grew as Lucius of Cyrene is mentioned as a prophet and a teacher. So we can at least put together the fact that Cyrene is growing in the Christian faith, and we might be right to speculate that it may have had a lot to do with Simon of Cyrene and his sons. And so it seems to be clear that he became a believer and shared this with his family. And so we have a man who stumbles upon a man, stumbling his own way to his own execution. And here is a man who bears the weight of another man's cross, only to no longer have to carry the weight of his own sin. Simon is the most unique character who was completely engulfed in what was necessary to take away man's sins. If you think about it, there's probably no one who comes close to experiencing that road of sorrow the way that Jesus did, apart from Simon of Cyrene, because he's literally carrying the cross to the place of execution and watching Jesus suffer all along the way. When the lyrics like, "I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon that cross," apart from Christ himself, I think Simon of Cyrene was probably the closest that there is to being able to experience that. And so from Simon's perspective, I think we have a lot to take in. You know, for Simon, he took in all of the punishment of Jesus. He experienced what it was like to follow Jesus' command to take up his own cross. We see in Simon that you can be coerced into something only for you to open your eyes and to see it for what it really is. And as Jesus is stumbling through the roads and Simon stumbles upon him, what once was coercion has now turned to conversion. That conversion then splintered off into his sons, who made their way into the pages of history, biblical history, as missionaries and teachers of the gospel. And so God can use some of the most unusual moments of life and the unusual circumstances of life to bring about great, great change. And so I'll leave you with this question. How did you stumble upon Jesus? And what effect has that had in your life? How has knowing Jesus personally for you impacted those around you, whether it be your family or your friends or other loved ones? And can you see the sovereignty and the grace of God in bringing you into contact with the living God through Christ Jesus? I hope this has been helpful for you as you ruminate a little bit on the passion of Jesus Christ. God bless you. Take care.